I want to talk about the sociological imagination. So, if we were in a face to face classroom, I might say, all right, class, tell me, and you can even think of some yourself if you want, but I would say, class, what do you think are some social problems that exist in the United States? And here are some answers that I've heard before in my face to face classes. I've heard people talk about racial issues, like we're seeing some of those issues happening right now when it comes to profiling, when it comes to some brutality issues. People have talked about environmental issues. Obviously, the virus has caused even more issues like unemployment, and perhaps it could exacerbate um, the gap that exists between the very wealthy and the poor. But the one that I like to talk about in class, and I want you to think about in your journal entry, is about obesity. Okay, and so specifically, I'd say, well, tell me what you think are some causes for childhood obesity. Okay, the sociological imagination is so important to understanding how sociologists think because we don't victim blame. That does nothing to help us, right? We say, oh, well, obesity exists because people are lazy. Well, that's not entirely accurate. Perhaps some people are. Um, or you say, well, people don't eat right. Okay, well, why don't they eat right? So it's looking beyond the individual circumstances to look at social circumstances. Um, and so I like to target childhood obesity more than I do obesity because I think it allows folks who don't tend to think sociologically about things that are outside of the control of children, right? And so I've asked you to think about those things in your reflection. I'm going to hint at a couple things. So feel free to use them and expand on them in your entry. But when I think of causes for childhood obesity that are outside of really their control, I think about, okay, well, you know, what are things that are being offered in the schools? Hmm. Well, a lot of schools provide very unhealthy meals for children, especially low-income children who are dependent on free and reduced meals. So my wife's a school teacher, and if you happen to go to a school where um, they meet certain requirements that all students get breakfast, that breakfast often is a sugary carbohydrate. So really no nutritional value there. Um, some one thing she sent me a picture of had almost 40 grams of sugar in it. So, which the intake for a person shouldn't be really much more than 25 grams of sugar in a day. When it comes to buying healthy foods, uh, are they more or less expensive than fast foods? And do they perish faster? So that could lead people to purchase more unhealthy um, non perishables or even fast foods that often are inexpensive or less expensive than healthy options. So these are things where we're saying, well, these are outside of the control of the child. What about exercise? Well, in many low income areas, especially in urban areas, there may not be safe places for children to exercise. We know that a lot of schools have removed a lot of their time for exercise, for gym, and so on. Um, they've lessened that amount of time that children that our students in K through 12 get, and that could also lead to lack of exercise. I don't want to keep going on and on because I want you to be able to reflect on some of your own um, ideas. I do want to point out that the sociological imagination is not an excuse for people to make poor decisions, but rather it's a way to really understand and look for social patterns. So, so when we look for these social patterns, ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to look for, okay, well, it turns out, where do we see the highest obesity rates, right? And then in those areas, do we see certain things? I don't know how many of you have heard of things called food deserts. Typically, a food desert is referred to an area that where folks don't have access to a supermarket. And these are often in urban areas, and so not having access to a supermarket or easy access, and folks who might be using public transportation, going grocery shopping for massive amounts of things can be very difficult. Um, we might look at that. We might say, oh, okay, well, in these areas with the lack of supermarkets, so that means a lack of an opportunity to get healthy foods. We see that obesity rates are higher. Oh, there's really no place for safe exercise in these areas. Um, Perhaps that's something that leads to being overweight or obese. And so, really, what we're looking for are patterns that would exist, so that we could predict, okay, someone living in this area is going to be at a higher risk. And then ultimately, from a public policy perspective, what can we do to prevent, right? What kinds of things could we do in areas that um, would lessen someone's risk? And the easy way that I see, I mean, I wouldn't say it's easy, but because it would cost a lot of money, but would be to get into the schools and to really address the food that's being offered, exercise habits, and really in education. I know a lot of folks leave K through 12 and really don't have an understanding of what a balanced nutritious diet looks like. Um, and so perhaps that would be a way of intervening, a way for us to offer insight and potential policies that could lessen someone's risk of becoming overweight or obese. So again, I just wanted to really expand more on the sociological imagination. The idea here is that we try and remove our biases, and we try and look at things not in a way where we're victim blaming. Again, that doesn't do much for sociologists, right? We look at the problem. So if there's an obesity problem, um, instead of saying, well, that person did this or that person did this, that doesn't do much for us. Instead, we would say, well, what are the patterns show? And what policies could be put in place to lessen that problem? So if we're able to isolate after we've done our research, we're not victim blaming. Does little um, to understand and address these issues. Instead, again, really trying to look at things without biases, trying to see them for what they're worth, and then again look at the patterns. If we see if we see this for a lot of people, then that's outside of their control, right? And so we'll talk more about this issue, but hopefully not only have I given you a good understanding of the sociological imagination, but also some ideas for your first journal reflection for this topic.